Okay, thank you for joining us. Thank you for letting us know who's in the room and why you're joining a webinar about specially designed instruction. I know that this is a topic that is on people's minds as we head into the school year. Go ahead, Rachel.
Awesome. So before we dive in, just a quick note about some of our accessibility features. Zoom has a live captions option available. Feel free to use that if it serves you. You can turn those on at the bottom of your screen. We also will be using the chat throughout our session, so feel free to use the chat as you have thoughts, ideas, or questions. You don't have to raise your hand to participate, but we will be also using the poll feature throughout our session today. And just a reminder that a recording will be emailed to you after our session. So who are we? A little bit about Krista and I. My name is Rachel Burley, and I'm a program director with the Ability Challenge. And I'm super excited to be here today.
And like Rachel said, I'm Krista Reed. I'm also a program director at the Ability Challenge. My background is as a special ed teacher and then a special ed building and network district leader. I'm really excited to talk about specially designed instruction.
Awesome. So as we stated, we work for the Ability Challenge, which is a nonprofit, and kind of the framework for our organization is the Thrive framework, which you can see on the right part of your screen. So this is how we think about what are the knowledge, mindsets, and practices students need to thrive in their schools. And so we'll walk through it quickly. First, we have culture. So does staff actually believe all students belong and demonstrate practices that align to that? Then we have instruction. Is teaching rigorous and accessible for all learners? We have special education knowledge. Do staff understand how disability impacts learning and what IDEA requires? Then we move into systems. Are people, time, and resources organized to meet diverse needs? And our last element is family partnerships. So are families real partners in the work, and how can we meaningfully include them more? So these five elements are what shape our framework, and we're happy to share it with you. So a little bit more about us as an organization. Our work begins a lot of the times with assessment. So we take time to understand the school's current strengths, challenges, priorities. From there, we're able to provide targeted training to strengthen educator and leader knowledge and practice. And then we also provide coaching that helps teams move from learning to implementation. So we also have a lot of practical tools and resources. So together, these supports help schools implement that Thrive framework. And our ultimate goal is to ensure that diverse learners do not simply go to school, but they are accessing learning and being meaningfully included. So this is where we're headed today. So we're going to start by defining SDI. We're going to practice identifying it, and then you'll have the opportunity to close, well, to ask some questions before we close. So to get us started, I have a question for you. If you could drop in the chat one word that comes to mind when you hear specially designed instruction. All right, I'll give you some typing time and go. All right, I'm seeing words special education, individualized, important. Yes, all of those are great words. And you're going to learn a lot more about specially designed instruction, or as we call it, SDI today. So, what is specially designed instruction? We'll begin with the official definition. So, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, also known as IDEA, is the federal law governing special education. IDEA defines specially designed instruction, or SDI, as adapting the content, methodology, or delivery of instruction to address a student's disability-related needs and ensure access to the general education curriculum. So, SDI is at the heart of special education. To be eligible for special education services under IDEA, a student must not only qualify as having a disability, but also require specially designed instruction. And so the purpose of SDI is to ensure that students with disabilities can access the general education curriculum, make meaningful progress, and work toward the same academic standards as their non-disabled peers. So inclusion alone is not enough. A student can be physically present in a general education classroom and still lack meaningful access to instruction. So SDI provides the individualized instruction needed to remove those disability-related barriers to help students grow and make progress. And a last note is that SDI is tailored to each student's unique needs as outlined in their IEP. So this is kind of what distinguishes SDI from a general strategy that might benefit the entire class. Two students with the same disability category may require very different instruction based on their strength, needs, and barriers because they're different. So an IEP should identify the student's disability-related needs, and SDI should directly respond to those needs.
In other words, I'm going to summarize what I heard you just say, Rachel, which is that SDI is never a one size fits all, right? Like when I think about SDI, I can't just go, well, most students are going to struggle with decoding this passage, right? That would not be SDI because I'm not thinking about an individual student and what they need to be successful in that general education classroom or lesson or unit, right?
Facts.
So let's drill down on that even further. Let's get real technical.
You want to take it away?
Sure, yeah. I think this is a good way of thinking like visually about some of the words that you've just said. What is special about special education, right? We just said it is the SDI. When we identify a kid and we say, hey, we think they might be a student with a disability, we're not just looking to see if they meet the diagnostic criteria for autism, right? There are students who have a medical diagnosis of autism, but will not need an IEP because they don't require what's on the right side in the pink box, specially designed instruction, right? Some of the other things that we do that is just good teaching or just high quality core instruction will be enough to meet their needs. So, for example, UDL, right? Universal Design for Learning. That is when we proactively design instruction to reduce common barriers. We create multiple ways for students to access learning. We we say, look, our class is full of learners. They're all diverse. We got to have lots of different ways for kids to make meaning during this lesson. So we use the UDL framework and we universally design our instruction. Another thing that teachers do that creates high quality core learning experiences is to differentiate, right? Differentiated instruction is another strategy that teachers use. And this is when they respond to the impact of barriers for groups of students, right? They might adapt what they teach or the process or the product even, right? The assessment that we give to students, we might differentiate it based on their interests or how ready they are to learn something. But it's the SDI that's different. SDI is for students with disabilities only, right? It's our legal responsibility to adapt the content, the methodology, our delivery of that instruction in line with what we know about the individual impact that that student's disability has on their learning experiences. These approaches complement one another, but they're not interchangeable. UDL supports variability, it's predictive, right? Differentiation is usually kind of responsive to what we see students need. Um, and SDI is something that needs to be layered in on top of the other two for students with disabilities. I hope that helps because I feel like these words get thrown around a lot and teachers might accidentally say, well, I'm differentiating for him or her. Okay, but what? We got to talk about the specially designed instruction. That's more than differentiation. So when you're thinking about what do you see teachers use most often in classrooms? Oh, good. Someone just said that's very helpful. I'm glad. Yes, and administrators and leaders might confuse this too, right? We're all learning a lot at all, and leaders are in that bucket as well. And so if you're coaching and leading special educators, it's important that you understand the distinction between those things and you can help define it and you know it when you see it. So if you're thinking about your school or your system and you're thinking like, I'm not sure my leaders or my, my coaches or my instructional leaders in the building or the district could really define this well, that might be a place to start. Okay, folks are chiming in the chat. Which of these three do you feel like teachers are using most often or the least? Folks saying differentiation is typically what people go to when they see or they sense that there's learner variability in the room, right? I see, okay, I recognize that my students are all different. They all need different things. And so I'm going to differentiate. I would say I hear that term the most for sure. What about you, Rachel?
I would agree. I think for so long, the kind of number one phrase was, did you differentiate? Is there differentiating? But I think what we'll start hearing more is what specially designed instruction is present in this classroom. So,
Yeah.
an exciting pivot.
Do you think currently SDI feels like the thing that you hear about the least?
I definitely say so.
Yeah.
I definitely say so. And it's funny because it's been written in IDEA for so long, but I think at least here in Tennessee, the term specially designed instruction just started being incorporated on student IEPs. And so the question becomes, what is the specially designed instruction the student requires? And previously, that language wasn't used anywhere in the IEP. So I do think that it is a shift that we will see more of. And I think it's good to continue building this foundational knowledge of it.
Yeah. And when I think back, I know you presented the Thrive framework, right? When I think about also what might be at play here, regional differences, like how long has the state been using that term in formal documentation definitely matters. But I think the other thing, I think in the chat, someone just said people use inclusion and believe they're addressing SDI. Yes, that's exactly what I'm thinking, right? Students, if you've seen the news lately, students are spending more time in the general education setting than ever. And so folks are making meaningful shifts to make sure kids are in the physical spaces they need to be to access general education content, learning, grade level standards. But when you think about SDI, I think maybe potentially our assumption's been that's what they get when they're with the special educator. And so it's something that 90% of the school didn't have a line of sight into. So there's some magic happening over there with a special educator. She's helping address his or her, or he's helping address his or her learning needs that come from their disability. And then when they come into my general ed class, I can just teach because those needs have been addressed in their 30-minute pullout, right? But we're seeing that 30-minute pullout less and less. Folks are co-teaching more, they're collaborating more, and that SDI piece is maybe getting lost in the sauce because we assumed it was always happening over here when folks were in their pullout resource rooms. And now we have to figure out how do we bring SDI to where a child is. All right, so let's talk about what SDI is because it maybe does feel like this magical thing that only special educators know how to do, right? So when I think about SDI, we're talking about what teachers will intentionally do, right? It is about the instruction that they will provide. We said this earlier, it is directly linked. It needs to address the disability related needs and IEP goals of that student. The intention is that that instruction would increase their access or progress in the same standards that all the other students are expected to address. It's not a separate curriculum, right? It's not only for students addressing alternative standards. And to the greatest extent possible, we're talking about using research or evidence-based practices that we know, back to the relates to students' disability related needs, right, work best for that student and their particular instructional needs. Um, and this is what I also think is important to say. It is pre-planned and we are continuously evaluating its effectiveness, right? It's not just oop, Johnny's struggling. Let me try something real quick. Although you always want to do that, right? Reactive supports to once a student is struggling to access are not necessarily SDI, right? It's not pre-planned instruction. Now, IDEA doesn't say that SDI is just what special educators do, right? In the federal guidance, in OSEP guidance, in state guidance, most folks know that this has become recognized as a shared responsibility. So I want you to take a look at the list here of core responsibilities that we have on the screen. Think about your own role, whether you're an administrator, whether you're a paraprofessional, a special ed or a gen ed teacher. Take a look at what your sort of roles and responsibilities are when it comes to SDI. If there's anything that you would add or anything that you see here that, causes you to have a question, feel free to use the chat. Because I think this is a place where we haven't had a ton of conversation. Someone said, this is great guidance, right? This might be guidance that your team has never seen. This might be something that this is news to some folks, right? To know, oh, wait, I have a role to play in SDI too. Yes. And right. So we aren't just talking about what counts as minutes, but of course, there are states that say, hey, for it to count as a special ed minute, it does need to be delivered by a special ed teacher, right? SDI, let's think real expansively. Students need SDI potentially throughout their day, right? Not just for the 30 minutes of service time that a special educator or a related service provider is providing it to them. So, want to make sure that we don't conflate those ideas of like what counts as minutes versus what will reduce the barriers of access and progress for students throughout the instructional day. A special ed teacher might pull a student for 25 minutes and provide SDI. And chances are, we'll get into this in a second when we talk about all the elements, the content, the methodology, the delivery, right? A 20-minute dose of what a student really needs to address their disability related needs in reading is not going to be enough to move the needle for that kid. That SDI is going to have to be integrated and repeated when they're in a regular ed reading class. They're going to have to bring those skills and transfer what they just learned into that space as well. So, guess what? SDI is coming around again.
And so, our key idea here is that specially designed instruction is a shared responsibility across members of the IEP team and the student's general education teachers. Meaningful progress happens when general educators, special educators, administrators, and support staff work together to ensure that instruction meets the needs of every learner.
All right, so let's get into all of those technical terms around the definition of SDI. We just said SDI is the adaptation of the content, the methodology, and the delivery of instruction. So, what do we mean by that? Content, we're talking about the academic and functional instruction or the skills that that student needs to be taught because they have a disability. Methodology would be how we know we need to structure learning for that student. Again, because of what we know they need based on the disability that they have and how it affects them. Same with delivery, right? It is the where and when and with whom part of the instruction that might need to be adjusted based on the student and their disability related needs. And again, just a reminder, right? It's all about the unique needs that that child has because they happen to be a student, say, with autism or a student who is blind or hard of hearing. So students may not need all of those components adapted, right? Maybe just one adaptation to one piece is going to be enough to increase access. But typically, we do see that if we're adapting the content, that might mean that there's a special methodology that we have to use. We'll talk about that in just a second. So, students might not require all of those things to be adapted in every lesson all of the time, all day by all the people. But the other thing is that it's a continuum, right? Adaptations can be slight, there could be no change at all to, say, the content, right? So, we'd fall on that left side of the chart, or it might be a really significant change to the curriculum. So we're talking about could be pieces and it could be on a scale of adaptation. So let's talk about content for just a second. Content adaptations. This is
Krista,
where
sorry.
we Sorry, what was that?
Sorry, I want to know if you saw the question in the chat.
Oh, sorry. The question in the chat says, can gen ed teachers collect IEP goal data too? I get this question a lot. Maybe the assumption is, again, that's someone else's responsibility, right? I think, I hope the next three slides might help answer that in just a second. So if I don't, chime back in with a more targeted question. But so when I think about content adaptations, right, this is where we ask, what does this child need to learn? Because they have these unique disability related needs, right? That would not already be in the general ed content. So I think the most obvious example of this is a student who's blind. A student who is blind needs to learn Braille. We would all agree that that is content that they would need to learn. It's a skill and it is content that would not be in the general education curriculum. So a content adaptation would be when we're talking about reading instruction or math instruction, we have to teach the student how to access Braille. Um, so what does the child need to be taught that's not going to be addressed just by virtue of being a fifth grader who's taking math or reading, for example? What functional areas are impacted by their disability? Is there any additional knowledge or skills that's required for them to master those IEP goals? So you can think about, for example, targeted instruction, some foundational skills that maybe the student missed because they're dyslexic and those foundational skills are not strong. Decoding, phonological awareness, right? You might be a fifth grader who is dyslexic. We're not doing phonics instruction anymore most of the time in the general ed curriculum for fifth grade, but this student still needs that content. So, oh, and we have sign language and Braille instruction for students with who are hard of hearing or blind, right? It might be a reduced or prioritized set of standards for students whose disabilities are so significant that they are on an alternative pathway to a diploma and they're taking an alternative assessment, right? Typically, that's what we do see is a reduced or prioritized set of adapted standards. The other thing here is when we talk about functional skills, we're talking about executive functioning. This is like a hot topic across gen ed, special ed. Our kids need explicit instruction and support for executive functioning skills. This is true whether you have a disability or not, but for some students, let's say a student with ADHD, they're going to need explicit instruction on some elements around executive functioning. Now, if I think about that for just a second, if a student is expected to, for example, um, have better working memory or have better skills around planning and prioritizing, right, before they start a complex task. I'm a special ed teacher. I might teach the student some strategies in a pull-out session, or maybe I go in and co-teach and I specifically work with the student in a small group on planning and prioritizing. Where that's really going to be important is when the student is not with me, when they're out in general ed classes, when they're in a science lab, right? I'm teaching the student to do this thing. I'm teaching them a functional skill. Maybe I'm providing very explicit instruction and practice on that. But the point is, they need to use it out in the real world with real learning tasks with people who are not just me. So, do I want that science teacher to help me collect data on whether the student is using, let's say it's a graphic organizer, or maybe it's a checklist, right? To help them plan and prioritize better. Of course I do. I care about that skill being generalized outside of the resource classroom or outside of a co-taught reading room. So yes, folks can help collect IEP data too. We want that. Most of the time, our IEP goals are written so that they can be generalized in places outside of just a special education or special setting. So my answer is yes. Now, the extent to which that's feasible when we create the conditions for people to do that well, that's a bigger question for us as leaders. We can't always expect people to know exactly how to do that and how to contribute meaningful data, but we can create the conditions for it for sure. Okay, so that was content. Methodology. Instead of asking what does the student need to learn, now we're talking about how does a student need to learn, right? How do they need to be taught because of their disability related needs, right? Some of this depends on the content we're teaching, right? What does research say is the best way to teach Braille to a student who is newly blind, right? Just lost vision. There's research and there are evidence-based practices that we know work really well and some that don't work as well. So we ask ourselves those questions. What methods work best and what methods have not worked for the student? This is where our knowledge of the student and maybe interventions that we've tried in the past really come into play. and what techniques are necessary to use for a particular instructional approach. These might be techniques, strategies that would not be present in the general ed curriculum. Maybe we're talking about a very exploratory and sort of self-directed approach to math in our general ed curriculum, but this student needs explicit, repeated instruction. And we know that's going to work for them because of their disability related needs. And so we need to fold that in. So you'll see explicit instruction is at the top of the list here. It works very well for most students with disabilities, not all, but explicit instruction with clear modeling, think alouds, and sort of that gradual release and guided practice. Adding multisensory routines, practice that incorporates immediate feedback, immediate corrective feedback, or many, many rounds. We know students with disabilities often need sometimes 20, 30 more times practice than their non-disabled peers. And so adding additional rounds of practice is an important methodology adaptation that we would want to consider for most students. Rachel, I see you're off mute. You want to add anything?
Yeah.
No. Okay.
But the final area that we also can adapt is the delivery. So delivery refers to where, when, and with whom instruction occurs. So as well as we can adapt the instructional setting for students. So for example, a student might receive small group instruction during the core instructional block or one-on-one instruction during intervention or an advisory period. Instruction could be co-taught. It could be with a special educator providing targeted support with the general education teacher. But delivery adaptations are meant to be flexible, but attend to whatever the student needs. So it could also include maybe front loading vocabulary for a student before an ELA block or providing additional practices during homework for students if that's what they need. So there's some examples here on the slide, so feel free to take a look. But kind of the questions we want you all to consider when it comes to delivery adaptations is who is the best person to deliver the instruction? When and where should instruction occur? What grouping is most effective? How much time is needed? How can we deliver this instruction to allow for sufficient practice and explicit feedback? With, of course, understanding what you said, what is required from IEP service minutes, but outside of those service minutes, these are some questions we can ask when we think through delivery adaptations. And so I also just want to stamp that these decisions should be based on the student's needs, not on staffing or scheduling or convenience, but actually attend to what it is the student needs.
Okay, we're gonna watch a very short, but I think very powerful example of what I would consider SDI, right? Something that moves beyond UDL and differentiation, but is targeted and specific to a student named Axel. Axel is a bilingual fifth grader who has autism, and he does not yet have a reliable means of communication. His team is working on it. If you watch the whole video, you will see that eventually they work with Axel to get him a device, and he is able to use that to communicate with his classroom peers and his teachers. And it is just a wonderful transformation to watch. Highly recommend just Googling or going on YouTube and looking up Axel special education. Um, he has IEP goals that focus on identifying the key details from stories that support a given claim. Like they want him to be able to access and make meaning from the stories that he's hearing in class, and that he's actually, they don't know it yet, but he can read. He is bilingual, he is biliterate. But without that reliable means of communication, they're unsure what Axel knows and what he's accessing and taking away from that instruction. So, spoiler alert, it's a lot. The clip we're about to watch, the students are engaged in a reading lesson where they're expected to, on their own, after they read, complete a Venn diagram that compares and contrasts two versions of a Jack and the Beanstalk story. So, as you're watching, I want you to be thinking about, what do I see being adapted right now? Is it the content? Are they changing what Axel is learning? Is it the methodology? Is it how they're instructing him? or how he is expected to demonstrate learning, or is it the delivery of the instruction? Um, and it may be more than one. You might see two things being adapted, three, all three. So pay close attention. I'm going to stop sharing just for a second to make sure that I share my audio here. But you're gonna want to hear that. And here we go. Just kidding. There we go.
So, did they both chop down the beanstalk? Did only the original story, or did the trial?
Can you point where it belongs?
Where does it belong? Point.
Yeah, put it where
Put it where it belongs. Axel, where does it belong? Good job. Jack and his mother were very poor. Was that in both the original or the trial? Put it where it goes. Here. Good job. Both or the trial? Put it where it goes. Good job.
They really started off from a point of saying, we think Axel is smart, capable of learning in our local school, capable of communicating lots of thoughts and ideas, but we don't presently understand exactly how to support him. But our starting point is going to be to think that he's smart and that our job is to put together the constellation of supports that will allow him to show that to people.
Think about that for just a second. What did you just see? What kind of adaptation did you see in the video? Go ahead and just use the chat because it might be more than one. Did they change what he was expected to learn? That would be content. Did they change how to structure and guide his learning? That'd be methodology. Or did they change the delivery, the where and the when and with whom he was being given instruction? You see a guess of methodology? What do you think, Rachel? Put you on the spot. Yeah, someone said they did not change the content. Right. They didn't change the academic or functional content that was being taught to everybody. Right. And that voiceover at the end, I think, really brings that out and brings that to life, right? They started with the assumption that we don't reliably know what Axel can know and do, right? Without a reliable means of communication, we don't know what he's capable of, but we're going to assume he's capable of the same things that everyone else was. And so we're not changing what he's learning, but we need to put some supports in place to guide and structure his learning a little bit differently, given the impact that his disability has on his communication, his ability to communicate. So there were some changes to the structure and how they were guiding his learning. You saw with methodology, most kids were not putting sentence strips onto an enlarged Venn diagram, right? And physically placing ideas where they go. They were writing them out, but again, we knew his disability impacted his ability to do that. So they really asked themselves, okay, if autism is a disability that affects his verbal and nonverbal communication and his social interactions, how could we structure this learning experience to address that for Axel? And so they did make some changes to the methodology. They said, how do we need to teach him this to ensure that he's accessing and making progress in this Jack and the Beanstalk comparison lesson? And Rachel, you said delivery, right? What did you see that was maybe an adaptation to delivery?
Well, who he was working with, where he was working was a little bit different than other people in the class.
Exactly, right? We needed an opportunity for him to maybe engage with peers. Maybe he's going to be more responsive to a peer asking him those questions than an adult. We're learning that about him and about his disability and the impact of it. And so I think they made some smart choices. And again, not only smart, but based on the steadfast belief that this child is capable of maybe more than we can possibly know at this moment. And so the least dangerous assumption we could make is let's change how he learns and let's support how and when and with whom and not the content right away. Think about your own school or classroom or district, right? What is one type of adaptation, could be delivery adaptation or others, that you typically see? what do you see folks adapting most often?
I think one that comes to mind for me is I previously worked at a high school, and we would specifically schedule some of our students that we knew had trouble focusing, especially in the afternoon. We'd schedule their core classes to be at the beginning of the school day where they were most alert and focused.
So that'll be a delivery adaptation, right? The timing of that instruction was changed to address what you knew was a disability related need. Yeah. Yeah, someone said expectations, which I think a lot of times ends up being a content adaptation, right? We're reaching for a let's change what the student is expected to learn first before we maybe do our due diligence on what if we tried a different methodology? What if we timed this learning differently? What if we, were more explicit in our instruction or provided that student with more practice and feedback rounds before we go to, well, let's change what they're expected to learn, right? And that feels like a way to differentiate for that student, but we've really missed the core of what SDI could be for that kiddo when we do that. So, how do folks begin to figure out what changes students need, right? And in Axel's, in the example with Axel, there were some pretty obvious barriers that were stemming from his disability, but this is where we encourage folks to say, go to the source, go to the student's evaluation, right? We have wonderful school psychologists who do a very good job in the body of those reports saying, here's the student's disability, here's the ways that it's impacting their access and progress in the general education curriculum. And those things need to be brought to the IEP. And so you got IEP goals, evaluations, and present level information that we really need to mine and look for. Okay, so what does that mean about the content and the methodology or the delivery changes that we might need to make to the student's instructional day so that they can access and make progress? Um, so for an example, if a student's IEP said something like this, by the next annual IEP, when provided a visual schedule of her daily routine and asked what comes next, Becca will verbally state the correct activity in 4 out of 5 daily trials across 3 consecutive days, right? When we think about a specific goal like this, we're thinking about the conditions piece of the goal. That's a great place to start to think about what's the instruction here then? If she needs to be given a visual schedule and able to say what comes next, we're going to have to provide some explicit instruction on that sort of executive functioning piece of using the tool of a daily schedule. There's SDI right there. And then you can think about what flows from that. Who needs to do this? How often? In what settings, right? We don't want her just doing this one time a week in a pullout with a special educator. This has to happen consistently for a student like Becca for this to be a tool that actually helps her develop and sustain those executive functioning skills long term.
Awesome. So now we're going to get into applying some of the knowledge that we've been learning to some scenario practices. So just to reground us, I want to remind us that SDI should have the following qualities. So describe what teachers will intentionally do or provide to the student, be directly linked to the student's disability-related needs and or IEP goals, increase the student's access to progress in the general education curriculum, rely on research or evidence-based approaches or techniques, and be pre-planned and continuously evaluated. All right, so keeping that in mind, in this next section, we are going to review a few different classroom scenarios. And I want you all to ask yourself these 3 questions. Is the teacher intentionally providing instruction designed for a specific student? Does the scenario include an adaptation to the content, methodology, or delivery? Is the instruction directly tied to the impact of the student's disability? All right, and so after reading each scenario, you're going to respond to a poll. It'll pop up, and you're going to select, yes, this is SDI, or no, this is not SDI. All right, so we're going to jump right in with our first scenario. I'll read it. Feel free to read to yourself as well. Student A is a second grader with a specific learning disability in written expression that affects his ability to produce complete sentences. While co-teaching in the general education classroom, the special education teacher delivers targeted mini lessons to the student before writing each day. She models using sentence frames to write complete sentences before student A is expected to generate his own piece of writing. Other students whose exit tickets data indicates they would benefit from the mini lesson also join the group. Is this SDI or is this not SDI? Woo woo! Oh yeah.
So you
All
guys can
right.
see that. I don't know if everyone's going to be able to see that on the recording, but 3 out of 3.
So 100% of people said yes, this is SDI. Feel free to drop why you think it is SDI in the chat, but I'm also going to explain. So this instruction is individualized and it's directly connected to student A's disability with written expression. So the teacher has adapted both the methodology and the delivery by providing explicit modeling, guided practice, and sentence frames, as well as immediate feedback in a targeted instructional setting. So the support is not simply making the assignment easier, but it's teaching the specific skill that student A needs to make progress in the general education curriculum.
Now, I think what might throw people with
Is
this
that other kids
example,
were
we started with
included?
one, is other kids might benefit from that instruction. I want to be
Right.
really clear about that. We talk about this all the time in our SDI trainings. When you design instruction for a specific student and then you realize, oh, there are some kids here who would also benefit from that instruction, it does not erode the fact that it was SDI, right? We worked from sort of the inside, individualized out. It's called, it's just called, having that
Incidental
benefit.
benefit,
Yeah, it's like there's that extra benefit that students can also, benefit from the instruction that you are designing for a specific student. That doesn't make it not SDI. But that can throw a lot of people off. They might say, well, now it's not SDI, it's differentiation. False.
not this group. All right. Student B. Student B is a fourth grader with a specific learning disability in reading fluency. During independent reading time in the general education classroom, the special education paraprofessional sits beside the student and reminds him to whisper read during independent work time. She checks in every few minutes to ensure he stays on task. If he becomes distracted, she redirects him back to the text. Is this SDI or is this not SDI?
Let's relaunch that poll.
So remember those 3 questions.
Right. Pretty unanimously said this is not SDI. And I would agree with that, right? The teacher is certainly the paraprofessional is certainly monitoring and redirecting, but not providing instruction, right? There's not a change to the instruction other than maybe the accommodation of some repeated reminders. It's not an evidence-based practice for supporting reading fluency. Like reminding a kid to read to themselves is not an evidence-based reading fluency instructional intervention. It's a realistic example of what we're doing for kids, but I would not call that SDI, right? It doesn't mean there's no value to having a paraprofessional work with a student who struggles with reading fluency. It's just not instruction. All right, one last one.
One more. All right. So during whole group instruction, the general education teacher prompts student C to use a step-by-step inference checklist that was previously introduced by the special educator. She reinforces his regular use of the checklist by occasionally modeling her own use of it when the student needs reinforcement. The general and special educator regularly discuss the student's progress monitoring data and what they observe about the student's independence with the checklist. Is this SDI or is this not SDI?
Oh, hold on. I got to relaunch the poll. There we go. Sorry. What do we think?
Woo, woo,
Right. We're unanimous again that this is SDI, right? The general ed teacher is helping the student generalize a skill after the explicit instruction was provided by the special educator, right? They are sharing the responsibility for embedding that in the spaces where it can actually minimize the impact that that disability is having for the student. This is the exact kind of support that directly addresses the student's disability's impact on inferencing, right? We know maybe he's got an IP goal around inferencing. This is a methodology adaptation, right? It teaches a cognitive process that's necessary for the student to access grade level content. It's helpful to point out that a checklist itself is an accommodation, right? And the instruction on how to use it and the reinforcement is the SDI, right? Same with a calculator. A kid is going to get an accommodation of a calculator. Somebody's got to teach Johnny how to use the calculator and make sure that he's getting feedback. Are you using it at the right times, right? So there's more to it than just, is it differentiation? Is it an accommodation? There's something that is often missing from classrooms that I would say we need to teach everybody about, and it's specially designed instruction.
And so, just as stamp, specially designed instruction is how educators adapt what, how, where, when, with whom students learn so that students with disabilities can fully access and make progress in grade level learning. All right, so as we close, we're going to finish a little bit how we started, and I want you to drop in the chat one word that comes to mind now when you hear specially designed instruction. I'll give you a moment. Go. All right, I'm seeing pre-planned, intentional, important, intentional. I think intentionality is one of my favorite words. Impactful, I love that one. Yeah. Designed.
Yeah. So when I think about, okay, we just talked about how this is knowledge that not everybody in our schools has, because for so long it felt like something that only a very small number of people in the building are responsible for, right? We've come a long way from having students with disabilities educated completely separate from their non-disabled peers. We are spending time in general ed classes. And so a lot of times we're hearing from folks, we need to build this knowledge and help people apply this inside the building across roles, right? And so if you're kind of in that headspace, we want to let you know this is exactly what we've designed our trainings around. We have self-paced and we have live, virtual, and in-person trainings that we bring to general educators, special educators, coaches, school leaders, district administrators, right? Your curriculum and instruction team, because again, everyone understanding this more deeply is going to mean that it gets embedded in the instructional spaces where it really matters for kids. And so we have our QR code off to the side. If you're here right now, scan that. If you're watching this right now, scan that so that you can get some of the resources that we have related to this and you can learn more about our training offerings. Um, maybe you're in a school where you say, I think people know this stuff. Maybe it's not a knowledge gap, but I'm not sure we've created the systems and the conditions where people can intentionally plan for this and have the collaboration that they need for this to go really well and cross all of the settings where kids are. So there might be sort of a assessing and redesigning of your instructional systems, whether that's planning, co-planning, IEP development, right? If you're thinking more at the like, what are the conditions we're creating for educators? We have lots of ways to support you in that too. And then if you're like, we've got that, but we need to tweak some stuff. We might need some custom tools. We might need to rethink how we are using some of the things that we planned for curriculum and instruction. We need some resources and tools. Connect with us, reach out. We have, lots of ways to customize support for you or to connect with you and be a thought partner about where you head next with this. So ways to keep this going. We have a lot of support for schools, networks, and districts that can really help you say, okay, I think this is what our people need, and we can bring it to them. So scan our QR code and let us know, how we might be able to partner with you and help you do this work. It's really important stuff, like we talked about. This is the key to unlocking the potential for students with disabilities in most schools. Anything you'd add here, Rachel? Sarah?
No. We want to thank you all so much for attending and joining us today. And just so you know, we do have another upcoming webinar around rethinking challenging behavior that will actually take place on August 5th, 2026, same time, same place. And so if you attended today or registered, you'll also be receiving a copy of this recording and resources via email.
An important topic that is definitely related, but so we'll share information about how to register with that too when we send out the recording. So thank you all for joining us. Have a great day. Thanks for being here.